At 75 years old, she was thrown out of her home. No savings. No family waiting. No place left to go. Just one suitcase, and a lifetime of memories she couldn't carry. But hidden inside that suitcase was a small rusted key. A key that would unlock a secret her grandmother kept for decades and change her life in ways no one could have imagined. Margaret had always believed that stability came from routine. For 32 years, she woke up in the same small apartment, made her tea in the same chipped mug, and sat by the same window where sunlight gently filtered through faded curtains. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Every corner held a memory, her late husband's laughter echoing faintly in the kitchen, the quiet evenings spent knitting by the lamp, the soft ticking of the clock that had outlived almost everything else in her life. That apartment wasn't just a place to live. It was the last piece of a world that had slowly disappeared over time. The morning everything changed felt strangely ordinary at first. Margaret had just finished folding her laundry, carefully stacking each piece as she always did when there was a knock on the door. Not a friendly knock, not the kind that came with a neighbor's smile or a delivery. This one was sharp, impatient, almost rehearsed. She paused, her hands resting on a neatly folded sweater, and listened as the knock came again, louder this time. When she opened the door, she found her landlord standing there, a man she barely recognized despite having seen him around for years. He avoided her eyes, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, holding a piece of paper that seemed to carry more weight than it should. Margaret felt a quiet unease settle in her chest, something she couldn't quite name yet. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he said quickly, as if the words had been practiced but never truly meant. "The building been sold. New management. They're clearing out all the old tenants." She blinked, not fully understanding. "Clearing out," she repeated softly, her voice almost lost in the hallway. "They've given notice. Immediate possession." He hesitated, then added, "You'll need to vacate today." Today? The word echoed in her mind, sharp and unreal. It didn't make sense. People didn't lose their homes in a single day. There were always warnings, conversations, chances to prepare. But as she looked at the paper in his hand, stamped and signed, she realized there would be no time for any of that. "I've lived here for over 3 decades, she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to remain calm. "There must be some mistake." He shook his head, still unable to meet her gaze. "I wish there was." For a moment everything felt distant, like she was watching someone else's life unfold from far away. The walls around her, once warm and familiar, suddenly felt cold and temporary. She turned slowly, looking at the small living room behind her, the worn sofa, the bookshelf filled with old novels, the photographs that told the story of a life well lived. How could all of this be reduced to a single sentence? "You'll need to leave today." She wanted to argue, to demand more time, to hold on to something that felt like it was slipping through her fingers. But the truth settled heavily in her chest. There was no one to call, no family nearby to step in, no savings large enough to cushion the fall. Life had quietly taken those things away over the years, piece by piece, until all she had left was this apartment. Margaret nodded slowly, more to herself than to him. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." But she didn't, not really. Understanding would mean accepting it, and she wasn't sure she ever could. The landlord muttered something about being sorry again before walking away, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Margaret stood there for a long moment, the open door framing a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Then she closed it gently, as if trying not to disturb the fragile reality that had just been shattered. Inside, the silence was overwhelming. It pressed against her ears, filling the space where certainty used to be. She moved slowly, almost mechanically, picking up items and placing them into an old suitcase she hadn't used in years. Each object she touched carried a memory, and each memory made it harder to breathe. She picked up a photograph from the shelf, her and her husband on a beach, smiling into the wind, younger and full of plans that had never quite turned out the way they imagined. Her fingers lingered on the image before she carefully placed it between her clothes, as if protecting it from the reality outside. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, indifferent to her situation. Time didn't slow down for heartbreak. It didn't pause for loss. It just kept moving, pulling her along with it whether she was ready or not. As the suitcase slowly filled, Margaret became acutely aware of how little she could take with her. A lifetime reduced to what could fit within a few inches of space. The rest, furniture, books, small trinkets collected over decades, would be left behind, stripped of their meaning the moment she walked out the door. She paused in the middle of the room, looking around one last time. The apartment seemed smaller now, as if it already knew she was leaving. The walls that once held her life now felt like they were closing in, eager to forget her existence. When she finally zipped the suitcase shut, the sound felt final. There was no going back after that. She picked it up, surprised by how light it felt. It wasn't just the lack of belongings. It was the realization that everything she couldn't carry was being left behind, not just physically, but emotionally. Margaret took a deep breath and walked to the door. Her hand rested on the handle for a moment, hesitation creeping in. Stepping outside meant facing a world where she had no place, no plan, no certainty. But staying wasn't an option. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, pulling the suitcase behind her. The sound of its wheels echoed softly, a quiet reminder of the life she was leaving behind with each step. As she reached the exit, she didn't look back. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew if she did, she might not be able to leave at all. Outside, the air felt different, colder, heavier, unfamiliar in a way she couldn't quite explain. Margaret sat on the bench longer than she realized. Her suitcase resting quietly beside her like it, too, had given up asking where they were going next. The world moved around her in a blur, cars passing, people talking, footsteps rushing somewhere important, but none of it seemed to include her anymore. It was as if she had slipped out of the rhythm of life without anyone noticing. She tightened her grip on her purse, more out of habit than purpose, and slowly opened it. Inside were only a few things she had managed to keep close: some crumpled bills, her identification, and an old photograph tucked carefully into the inner pocket. She pulled it out, her fingers brushing gently over its worn edges. It was a picture of her as a little girl, standing beside her grandmother in front of a house that now felt like it belonged to another lifetime. She stared at it, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of her grandmother's face. The soft smile, the kind eyes that always seemed to understand more than they said. For a moment, Margaret closed her eyes and let the memory settle in. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice again, warm and steady, calling her in for dinner or reminding her to bring her sweater before going outside. Those were simple days, back when the world felt predictable and safe. Her fingers shifted slightly, and that's when she felt it. A small object, cold and solid against her skin. She reached deeper into her purse and pulled it out. A key. Small, rusted, old enough to carry the weight of years. Margaret frowned, turning it slowly between her fingers. It wasn't a key she used often, if ever, but something about it felt familiar in a way that stirred something deep inside her memory. She stared at it for a long moment before whispering softly to herself, "Grandma's house." The words felt strange on her tongue, like something she hadn't said in decades. She hadn't thought about that house in years. Not really. Life had a way of moving forward, pulling her along with responsibilities, losses, and quiet routines that eventually replaced old memories. But now, sitting there with nowhere else to go, the past didn't feel so far away anymore. It felt close. Uncomfortably close. The house had been left untouched after her grandmother passed away. Margaret remembered the day clearly.
Heart touched? Like, share, and subscribe. What would you do? Comment below.
The way everything suddenly felt empty, Not just the house, but something inside her as well. After the funeral, she had visited a few times, each visit shorter than the last. Until one day, she simply stopped going altogether. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was that the memories inside those walls were too loud, too alive. And there was something else. Something she had never quite understood. The basement. Even as a child, Margaret remembered feeling curious about it. The door had always been there, at the end of the hallway, plain and unremarkable except for one detail. It was always locked. Always. She used to stand in front of it, staring at the handle, wondering what could possibly be inside that her grandmother didn't want anyone to see. Once, when she was very young, she had tried to open it. She still remembered the way the handle refused to turn, as if it was guarding something important. "Grandma," she had asked one afternoon, her voice filled with innocent curiosity, "what's in the basement?" Her grandmother had paused, just for a second. Then she smiled. Not a dismissive smile, not one meant to brush off the question. It was something else. Something gentle but distant. "One day," she had said softly, "you'll understand." Margaret never asked again. And over time, the question faded, buried under school, work, marriage, and the quiet unfolding of life. The basement became just another forgotten detail, something that existed in memory but held no place in her present. Until now. She looked down at the key again, her heart beginning to beat just a little faster. Could it be? No, it didn't make sense. Or maybe it did. Her grandmother had never thrown anything away. Every object had meaning, a purpose, a story behind it. If this key had stayed with Margaret all these years, unnoticed but not discarded, then maybe it wasn't an accident. Maybe it was meant to be found. A soft breeze passed through the street, brushing against her face, pulling her back into the present. She looked around again. The unfamiliar surroundings, the endless movement of strangers, the absence of anything that felt like home. There was nothing here for her. No place to return to. No one waiting. Just uncertainty stretching out in every direction. Except for one. The house. The thought settled slowly in her mind, at first hesitant, then growing stronger with each passing second. It wasn't just about having a roof over her head. It was something deeper than that, something unfinished. A part of her life she had left behind, without ever truly closing the door. Her grip on the key tightened. "What if it's gone?" she murmured quietly. "What if someone else lives there now?" The questions came naturally, filled with doubt and hesitation. After all, so much time had passed. The world didn't wait for anyone, and abandoned places rarely stayed untouched forever. But there was another voice inside her. Quieter. Stronger. What if it's still there? What if it's waiting? Margaret let out a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling as she weighed the decision. Fear lingered at the edges of her thoughts, but it wasn't overwhelming. Not anymore. Not after everything she had already lost that day. Because when you have nothing left, even the unknown starts to feel like a chance. She stood up slowly, her knees stiff from sitting too long, and reached for her suitcase. The handle felt familiar in her hand now, like a small anchor in a world that had become unsteady. The key was still in her other hand. She looked at it one last time before closing her fingers around it, as if sealing a quiet decision she hadn't fully spoken out loud yet. Maybe the past wasn't something to run from anymore. Maybe it was the only place left to go. The house stood exactly where she remembered it, as if time had simply forgotten to touch it. The paint had faded, the garden had grown wild, and the wooden gate creaked in protest as Margaret pushed it open, but it was still there, quiet, patient, waiting. She paused at the entrance, her suitcase resting beside her leg. For a moment she didn't move. The air felt different here, still, heavy with memories that hadn't been disturbed in years. It wasn't fear exactly, but something close to it. A hesitation that came from knowing she was about to step back into a part of her life she had long avoided. "I never thought I'd come back like this," she whispered under her breath. The front door opened with more ease than she expected. The key had turned without resistance, as if the house had been expecting her. Inside, a thin layer of dust covered almost everything, softening the edges of furniture and dulling the colors of what once felt alive. The scent of old wood and time filled the air, wrapping around her like a quiet reminder that nothing here had changed, except her. Margaret stepped inside slowly, her shoes pressing lightly against the floor as if she didn't want to disturb the silence. Each step echoed faintly, not loud enough to startle, but enough to remind her that she was no longer just visiting a memory. She was inside it. Her eyes moved carefully around the room. The same sofa, the same curtains, the same small table where her grandmother used to place fresh flowers every morning. Even the clock on the wall was still there, though it had long since stopped ticking. She reached out and touched the back of a chair, her fingers trailing over the dust. "You really left everything just as it was," she murmured, her voice barely louder than the quiet around her. There was comfort in the familiarity, but also a weight she couldn't ignore. This house held more than memories, it held questions. Questions she had never asked, or perhaps never wanted the answers to. Her gaze slowly shifted down the hallway. And there it was. The door. The basement door. It looked exactly the same, plain, unassuming, but somehow it carried more presence than anything else in the house. Even now, after all these years, it felt different from the rest of the rooms, separate, hidden. Margaret felt her chest tighten slightly. "That door," she whispered. She remembered standing there as a child, staring at it for minutes at a time, wondering what secrets it held. Back then, curiosity had been simple, almost playful, but now, standing here again, that curiosity felt heavier, sharper. Because this time she had the key. Her hand instinctively moved to her pocket, where the small, rusted key rested. She could feel its weight even before touching it. It wasn't just a piece of metal anymore. It was a choice. She took a slow step forward. Then another. Each movement felt deliberate, as if she were crossing an invisible line she had avoided for most of her life. The closer she got, the more she became aware of her own breathing, slightly uneven, a little too fast. "What if there's nothing down there?" she thought. The idea almost made her stop. After everything that had happened, the eviction, the loss, the sudden return to this forgotten place, what if it all led to nothing? Just an empty basement filled with dust and forgotten objects. But another thought followed quickly behind. What if there's something? Her grandmother's words echoed faintly in her mind, as clear as the day she first heard them. "One day you'll understand." Margaret swallowed, her throat dry. "I'm not even sure I want to understand," she admitted softly. She reached the door and stood still. Up close it didn't look as intimidating as it felt. The wood was worn, slightly chipped near the edges, and the handle had dulled over time. It was just a door. And yet it didn't feel like just a door. It felt like a boundary. Between the life she had known and something she didn't. Her hand slowly lifted toward the handle, but stopped just inches away. A quiet tension settled in her chest. This wasn't just about opening a basement. It was about facing something unknown at a time when she already felt fragile, when everything familiar had been taken from her, when even the simplest decisions felt heavier than they should. She closed her eyes for a moment. "What am I afraid of?" she asked herself. There was no immediate answer. Maybe it was the fear of disappointment. Maybe it was the fear of uncovering something she wasn't ready to see. Or maybe it was the fear that this door wouldn't change anything at all. Because if it didn't, then she would still be exactly where she started. Alone with nothing. Her fingers curled slightly, then relaxed. No, she whispered, shaking her head gently. She opened her eyes again, this time with a different kind of clarity. I've already lost everything, she said quietly. What's left to be afraid of? The words settled into her chest, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt since that morning. There was a strange kind of strength in them, not loud or dramatic, but steady. Real. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the key. For a moment, she simply looked at it. So small. So simple. And yet it had brought her all the way back here. All right, she said under her breath, almost like she was speaking to herself and her grandmother at the same time. Let's see what you wanted me to find. Her hand moved forward again, this time without hesitation. The metal of the key felt cold against her fingers as she guided it toward the lock. There was a slight resistance at first, as if the lock hadn't been used in years, but then it slid in. Perfectly. Her breath caught. She hadn't realized how much she doubted it would fit until that moment. Her grip tightened slightly as she turned the key. For a second, nothing happened. The silence stretched, almost teasing her. Then, a soft, unmistakable sound. Click. Margaret froze. The sound echoed louder in her mind than it did in the quiet hallway. It was small, almost insignificant, and yet it carried a sense of finality she couldn't ignore. There was no going back now. The door was no longer locked. All that remained was the choice to open it and step into whatever waited on the other side. The door opened slowly, as if it had been holding its breath for years and was finally letting it go. A faint, cool air rose from below, brushing against Margaret's face with a quiet, almost forgotten touch. She hesitated at the top of the stairs, her hand still resting on the edge of the door, her eyes adjusting to the dimness beyond. For a moment, she simply stood there listening. The house behind her was silent. The world outside felt distant, and the space below felt unknown in a way she had never experienced before. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small flashlight. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness in a thin, steady line. The light revealed a narrow staircase, wooden and worn, leading down into shadows that seemed to stretch further than they should. Margaret took a slow breath. "You've come this far," she whispered to herself. Her foot moved forward, testing the first step. It creaked softly under her weight, the sound echoing faintly as if the house itself was aware of her presence. She paused, listening again, but there was nothing else. No movement, no sound, just the quiet waiting. She took another step. Then another. Each one felt heavier than the last, not because of the effort, but because of what it meant. With every step down, she was moving further away from the life she understood and deeper into something she didn't. The air grew cooler as she descended, carrying a faint scent of old wood and time. Her grip tightened around the flashlight, the beam shaking slightly as it moved across the walls. And then her foot reached the bottom. She stood still, letting her eyes adjust as the light slowly revealed the room around her. It wasn't empty. Not at all. Boxes. Dozens of them. Carefully arranged, stacked neatly as if someone had taken great care in placing each one exactly where it belonged. They weren't scattered or forgotten. They were organized, intentional. Margaret frowned slightly, her curiosity rising. "This doesn't look abandoned," she murmured. She stepped forward, the floor beneath her solid but aged. The beam of her flashlight moved across the labels on the boxes, and her breath caught as she read the first one. To Margaret. She froze. Her name. Written clearly, in handwriting she recognized instantly. Her grandmother. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She moved closer, lowering herself slowly to her knees in front of the box. Her fingers hovered over the lid for a moment, as if she needed permission to open it. Then gently she lifted it. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, neatly stacked, tied together in bundles, each one marked with a date. Margaret picked one up, her hands trembling more now than before. She untied the string carefully and unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "My dear Margaret." Her chest tightened instantly. She swallowed hard, blinking back the sudden wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. These weren't just letters. They were moments, pieces of time preserved, waiting to be discovered. She set the letter aside gently and opened another box. Photographs. Old, slightly faded, but still clear enough to tell their stories. She picked one up, bringing it closer to the light. It was her, as a child, laughing, running through the garden. Another one showed her sitting beside her grandmother, both of them smiling at something outside the frame. Margaret's lips parted slightly, a quiet breath escaping her. "I don't even remember this," she whispered. And yet there it was. A memory she had lost, carefully kept by someone who never forgot. She looked around the room again, her mind racing now. "This was all for me," she said softly, disbelief creeping into her voice. Her gaze landed on something different this time. A small wooden chest. Unlike the boxes, it wasn't labeled. It sat slightly apart from everything else, placed with a kind of quiet importance that made it stand out without trying. Margaret stood slowly, her movements almost automatic as she stepped toward it. Her heartbeat quickened. There was something about it. Something that felt final. She knelt in front of the chest, her hand resting lightly on its surface. The wood was smooth but aged, the edges slightly worn from time. It wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. Its presence alone carried weight. Her fingers moved to the lock. She paused. The same key. It was still in her hand. She hadn't even realized she was holding it this tightly. For a moment, doubt crept in again. What if this changes everything, she thought. The idea lingered, heavy and uncertain. But then another thought followed. What if it's meant to? Margaret took a slow breath and guided the key into the lock. This time, there was no hesitation. It fit perfectly. Her hand turned gently, and with a soft click, the chest unlocked. She lifted the lid slowly, her breath catching as the contents came into view. Documents. Carefully organized, protected, preserved. She frowned slightly, picking one up and bringing it closer to the light. Bank statements. Her eyes narrowed in confusion as she flipped through them. Another document. Investment records. Her brow furrowed deeper. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured. Her grandmother had always lived simply. There was nothing in her life that suggested wealth or even financial comfort beyond the basics. And yet, these papers told a completely different story. Margaret's fingers moved faster now, turning pages, scanning numbers, dates, signatures. And then she saw it. The total. Her breath stopped. "No," she whispered, shaking her head slightly. It couldn't be right. The amount was more than she had ever imagined, more than enough to change everything, not just survive, but live. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. "All this time," she said softly, her voice breaking. Her grandmother hadn't just been saving. She had been preparing, planning, for her. Margaret's hands trembled as she continued searching through the chest, her emotions shifting from confusion to disbelief to something deeper, something she couldn't quite name yet. And then she found it. A letter, folded carefully, placed at the very top, as if it was meant to be found last. Her name was written on it. Not just casually, but with intention. Margaret stared at it for a long moment, her chest rising and falling as she gathered the courage to open it. Because somehow she already knew. This was the moment her life was about to change forever. Margaret sat on the basement floor for what felt like hours, the letter still resting in her hands, her grandmother's words echoing over and over in her mind. The silence around her was no longer heavy or unsettling. It had changed. It felt gentle now, like the house itself had been waiting for this moment, patiently holding on to a secret until she was finally ready to receive it. She looked around again, the boxes, the photographs, the letters, and realized something she hadn't fully understood before. None of this was accidental. Every detail had been planned. Every memory had been preserved. And every step she had taken, from losing her home to finding that key, had somehow led her right here. Her chest tightened, but this time it wasn't from fear or uncertainty. It was from something warmer, something stronger. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered softly, as if her grandmother might still hear her. But deep down, she already knew the answer. Because she wouldn't have understood back then. Because life had a way of teaching lessons only when you were ready to learn them. Margaret folded the letter carefully and held it close to her chest. For the first time since that morning, she didn't feel lost. She didn't feel like everything had been taken from her. If anything, it felt like something had just been given back. Not just money, not just a house, but a chance, a real chance. She slowly stood up, her knees stiff but steady, and took one last look around the basement before making her way back up the stairs. Each step felt lighter now, as if the weight she had been carrying all day had quietly lifted without her noticing. When she reached the top, she paused and looked back down into the darkness. It didn't feel dark anymore. It felt like the beginning of something. She closed the door gently, not to hide what she had found, but to protect it, like a promise she intended to keep. Upstairs, the house felt different too. The same furniture, the same walls, the same quiet air, but now it no longer felt like a place frozen in the past. It felt alive. Margaret placed her suitcase near the door and walked slowly into the living room. Her eyes moved across the space, no longer seeing it as something old or abandoned, but as something waiting to be rebuilt. "I guess we're starting over," she said quietly, a faint smile forming on her lips. The days that followed were not easy. Having a second chance didn't mean everything suddenly became simple. There were decisions to make, papers to sort, repairs to handle. The house needed care, attention, and time, and so did she. But this time, Margaret wasn't alone in her thoughts. Every letter she read brought her closer to her grandmother again. Every memory reminded her that someone had believed in her long before she stopped believing in herself. And slowly, something inside her began to change. The fear that once held her back started to fade. The hesitation that once defined her choices started to loosen its grip. And in its place, something new began to grow. Confidence. Not loud or dramatic, but steady, real. One afternoon, as she sat by the window, the same way she used to in her old apartment, Margaret found herself watching people pass by outside. Some looked tired, some looked rushed, some looked like they were carrying burdens no one else could see. And for the first time, she didn't just observe them. She understood them. Because just days ago, she had been one of them. With nothing, with nowhere to go, with no one to turn to. Her gaze softened as an idea quietly formed in her mind. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't loud. But it was clear. "This house," she murmured, "it doesn't have to be just mine." The thought lingered, growing stronger with each passing moment. She looked around again, imagining the empty spaces filled with something more than furniture, something more than memories. Purpose. In the weeks that followed, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She didn't just fix the house. She transformed it. The living room became a warm, welcoming space where people could sit, rest, and feel safe. The kitchen, once quiet and unused, came alive with the smell of fresh meals and the sound of gentle activity. And slowly, word began to spread. At first, it was just a few people, neighbors who noticed the open door, the warm light, the quiet invitation that didn't need words. Then more followed. People who needed a place to sit for a while. People who needed a warm meal. People who, just like Margaret once did, felt like they had nowhere else to go. She didn't ask questions. She didn't expect anything in return. She simply offered what she could. And somehow it was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and soft golden light filled the room, Margaret stood near the entrance, watching as a small group of people shared a quiet meal together. There was laughter, soft, genuine, and a sense of comfort that couldn't be forced or faked. Her eyes moved to the wall beside her. There, in a simple frame, was her grandmother's photograph. Margaret walked over slowly and stood in front of it, her hands gently clasped together. "I think I understand now," she said softly. Her voice didn't shake this time. It was calm. "Certain. You didn't just leave me something to survive," she continued, a small smile forming on her face. "You gave me something to share." She reached out and adjusted the frame slightly, her fingers brushing against it with quiet affection. "And I promise I won't waste it." For a moment she just stood there, letting the warmth of the room settle around her. The sound of life. The presence of people. The feeling of purpose. All things she thought she had lost forever. And yet here they were. Not returned in the same form, but given back in a way that meant even more. Margaret took a deep breath and turned back toward the room, her heart lighter than it had been in years. At 75, when the world had taken everything from her, she didn't just find a new beginning. She created one. And in doing so, she gave others a place to begin again too. Because sometimes, losing everything isn't the end of your story. Sometimes, it's the moment your real story finally begins. And sometimes, the doors we fear opening the most are the ones that lead us exactly where we were meant to be. The moral of the story is simple, yet powerful. Life can take away what you have, but it can never take away what you're capable of becoming. And when you choose courage over fear, even in your darkest moments, you don't just change your own life. You create light for others to find their way to. This story is created for emotional storytelling and inspirational purposes. While it reflects real-life struggles many people face, the characters and events are fictionalized to deliver a meaningful message about hope, resilience, and second chances.
Heart touched? Like, share, and subscribe. What would you do? Comment below.